Well, Robert, it's so great to be with you today. And what we're covering on the program is 3 reasons why Muhammad doesn't exist. So let's jump right in. What is your first reason?
The sources that give us the biographical information about him are all so late, several hundred years, 200 years and following after the time of his alleged life, that there was plenty of time for legendary material to enter in, and we cannot know actually anything for certain about this man.
Okay, so are you referring to the Hadith?
That's right.
Okay, and is your view that we don't have any other sources outside of the Hadith about his life?
Well, there's the Sirah literature, but that's just got the same problem. The Hadith and Sirah literature all date from the beginning of the 9th century, and people point out that they are dependent upon earlier works that have been lost, that were written, as if that were probative of something. But the fact is, we have works that were written that survive. For example, Ibn Sa'd and Waqidi, who date from roughly around the same time in the 9th century, with Waqidi being a little bit later, and he shows a tremendous amount of legendary elaboration in the stories that he shares with Ibn Sa'd. So, in other words, if you have that kind of legendary elaboration in written literature, in material that both dates from the 9th century, then it's reasonable to surmise and conclude that in the material that we have that's no longer extant, there was also legendary elaboration, to the degree that while there may have been some person around whom these legends began to be attached, we can't know anything about him.
Did you also make the point in your debate with David that in the Hadith literature, it's already known that there were legendary stories about Muhammad, and most of them were sort of like weeded out?
Yeah, that's actually my second reason. And so we can move on to that the Muslim sources themselves, the Muslim sources that give us the Hadith literature, tell us that the material that they are conserving and presenting to us is the result of a tremendous winnowing process in which they declared inauthentic a massive number of accounts of Muhammad's words and deeds. For example, Bukhari. Sahih Bukhari is supposed to be the Hadith collection that is most reliable. As a matter of fact, that's what Sahih means, reliable. And so when Muslims refer to the Hadith, they are most often referring to Bukhari. And when they refer to Bukhari, they are referring to something that Muslims will generally take as reliable. So it's considered to be an extremely important source. Now, Bukhari is somebody who, here again, lived in the 9th century, and he is said to have traveled all around the Islamic world gathering hadiths, gathering traditions about Muhammad, and he ultimately gathered together 600,000 of them, and then rejected 593,000 of those, 593,000 as forged, and kept the 7,000. And so when we have that number of forgeries, it is, once again, extremely difficult to sort out what is authentic from what isn't. And in the course of Bukhari's investigations, when he decided that these 7,000 were authentic, he did so on the basis of criteria that nobody can really honestly accept as establishing that the stories are authentic versus the others that he rejected. And that leads to the third point. Now, I know you wanted to go on, elaborate about this for quite some time, and I'm giving you all three at the beginning, but there's plenty that can be said about this. We won't run out of material. And
okay. No, I was actually going to ask you what that criteria was. And so maybe it just makes sense to go ahead and get into that third one and then have some back and forth.
Great. The third point is that the criteria used in traditional Islam to determine which stories of Muhammad are authentic and which are not are based on something that is inherently no more reliable than the stories themselves, and that is the isnad chains, the chains of transmission. Every hadith has a matan and an isnad. The matan is the story itself. If you go to sunnah.com, for example, you can't see this in the English. They don't usually put the matins, translate the matins. But if you click onto the Arabic, you can see that every story has they usually don't give you the isnad. Sorry, I said that backwards. The isnad is what is not there. The matan, the story, is there. You click on the Arabic and you also see the matan. I'm doing it again. I'm sorry. Very tired these days. You click on the Arabic, you also see the isnad, which is the chain of transmission. That Aisha said that she heard this from Muhammad, and so heard it from Aisha, and so heard it from the first so-and-so, and on and on and on to the person who's recording it. Now, the earliest matins, the earliest stories had no isnad. They had no chain of transmission listed. The earliest extant stories of Muhammad did not tell us who originated them and who was passing them on. But the standard criteria are that one has to have an unbroken chain, and every person in the chain needs to be reliable. If somebody in the chain is known not to be so honest or careful with the facts, then that chain becomes suspect. Or if somebody so-and-so heard it from another guy, but then we don't know heard it from so-and-so who brought it on to our own age, then it's not, or to the age in which it's being written down, then it's not reliable. But the thing is, the isnad chains date from even later than the stories, and they can just as easily be forged. If you want to have a story that everybody takes seriously, you load up your chain with reliable people that everybody loves. Done. And there are numerous stories that have different chains of transmission where it's clear that people who later on had a sullied reputation or something of that kind were replaced with people with sterling reputation because these stories the various powers wanted them repeated, wanted them to be considered canonical.
So do we have anything like this? I'm always thinking of like paralleling this with the Christian account, that we have about Jesus. Do we have anything like this with respect to the genealogy in the Gospels? You know, could they have just been making those up as well? Is there time for legendary development there?
They could have been. And this, of course, is something that many people have suggested throughout history. And this is one thing that I want to emphasize here at the beginning, that historical evaluation of the Gospels and the New Testament in general has been going on for several centuries, and Christians are not threatened by it. And yet suddenly, when I start and some other people start investigating Muhammad historically and the origins of Islam historically, everybody gets upset. And I find that odd. But in any case, to the question itself, we have in Matthew and Luke, we have two separate genealogies of Jesus. Now, there are various explanations posited for that one is Joseph's, one is Mary's. They are both made up. They are competing different versions of the same thing with divergences of detail, things like that. Now, we don't really know ultimately what the story is when it comes to those, but we do know some general principles, and that is that the Gospels were written within the lifetimes of people who knew Jesus and listened to him. And that is an extremely different situation from what you have with the Hadith literature, where it all starts to be written down 200 years after Muhammad. You have in the first 60 years of Christianity, you have the establishment of churches all around the Mediterranean area. You have the epistles of St. Paul and of St. Peter and James and John and so on. You have the post-canonical writings of St. Clement toward the end of the first century and others. At the beginning of the second, you have St. Ignatius of Antioch, who is said to have been the little child that Jesus puts in the midst of the people when he's talking at one point, and whether he was or not, clearly he was old enough in the year 107 when he wrote his letters that he could have been somebody who knew the apostles, one or more. And you have various others. You have in all those writings many references to the Lord, references to what he said and to what he did. You have non-Christians talking about what he said and what he did. So you take the same 60-year period in the 7th century for Muhammad, and you have an extremely different situation. You have the Quran, but you have not all of it, and you have, some indication from scholars such as Christoph Luxemburg and others that there may have been an ur-text, a text that the Quran is based upon, that was extant before the Quran. So you have the question of that. You have the fact that in the Quran itself anyway, there's only 4 mentions of Muhammad by name, and none of those contain any biographical information. You have a few mentions of Muhammad by non-Muslims, but you have none of them actually corresponding to the standard story of Muhammad as we have it today and as it is formulated in the Hadiths and the Sirah literature in the 9th century. So this is very strange. People say, well, there's a lot of slippage in history. And I've heard people say this recently amid the late controversies about these issues. And you can't expect everybody to get everything right. And that's certainly true. But you might expect somebody to get something right. And yet none of them do. And you also have a tremendous absence of attestation from 7th century people who encountered the Arabs, that there's scant mention of Muhammad and no mention of the Quran or Islam. Why not? Why the big secret? When later on it becomes the most important thing that they've got to say to anybody in any context at any point. So all this makes us think maybe these things didn't exist yet, and this is why nobody mentions them.
Isn't it also true, I've heard Jay Smith talk about this, that the of the mentions in the Quran, because in the original version, the Euthymonic text, it lacks the dots and the slashes.
That's right. Yeah.
Is that correct? And so when it mentions Muhammad, it could be referring to someone else. Is that true?
Well, it's not. Those two things don't necessarily go together. The thing is this, that in the first place, the Arabic language has 22 letters, the alphabet, and 16 of those letters are identical. They have another letter that looks just like them. There are only 6 that are unique in their shape. And the way that you distinguish those 16, the ones that look just like one other, or one or more others, is by the diacritical marks, the dots that go above or below the letter. So you have, for example, this shape. It's not very easy to do. I didn't bring flashcards, but in any case, you have this, kind of looks like an L backwards. And you put a dot over it, you put a dot under it, you put 2 dots, and it's different letters. So the earliest Qurans do not have any of those diacritical marks. And so people can not be entirely sure that the text is actually saying what they think that it says. I'll give you actually a famous example that is is repeated as a joke, but it actually contains a very important point. In chapter 2, verse 2, right at the beginning of the Quran, chapter 2, verse 2. This book, there is no doubt in it. All right? Now, doubt is raiba. But oil is zaita. And the letters R and Z are the same, except for the diacritical marks. And the letters B and T are the same, except for the diacritical marks. And so there's a famous story about a kid reading the Quran out early on in the life of Islam, and he says, this book, there's no oil in it. And that is an actually quite reasonable thing to think the book is saying when you do not have something specifying which letter is meant. And so what I think you're referring to when you're talking about, in the first place, what J. Smith says is the fact that the Quranic text is far more indeterminate than most people realize because of the slippage caused by the lack of the diacritical marks in the earliest manuscripts. But what Jay is referring to there is the fact that all the Arabic words are based on consonants, and you have marks that show the vowels. And the earliest Quranic manuscripts don't have those either. And when you're talking about Muhammad, you have MHMD, but when you strip away the vowels, it could be that somebody else is being referred to altogether, yes. And when the word is used, it has a meaning, Muhammad, the praised one. And so some people have posited that these 4 mentions of Muhammad in the Quran that contain no biographical information are actually the usages of a title, the praised one, that could refer to any number of other people.
Yeah, so that was one of my deepest questions was about the Quran itself mentioning Muhammad, and then the deeper question about the diacritical marks and whether or not that leaves open alternate interpretations. And then you're almost all 3 reasons involved the hadith, right? These sort of later mentions about Muhammad that the biographical information is sort of too far removed. What about his name is slipping my mind right now. That what is one of the earliest Christian writers that spoke about Muhammad?
Are you talking about St. John of Damascus?
Yes, yeah. St. John of Damascus. Okay, so here's a theory. What if there was no Muhammad depicted by the hadith literature or the Sirah literature? There was no such person that matched all that criteria. However, there was a person that matched the sort of earlier sources that we have from St. John of Damascus and some of these earlier non-Muslim writers. There was some person named Muhammad that did some things along those lines. Would you be open to a theory like that?
Yeah.
Or would you still say no?
Well, see, this is where we have to define what we mean by there was no Muhammad. And that is a statement that can actually admit of numerous different interpretations. And the one that I favor is not to say there was never any such person. There could have been such a person. There could even have been a warrior prophet, because some of the earliest mentions, non-Muslim mentions of Muhammad, are of a warrior prophet. And a warrior prophet is certainly what he was. At the same time, the Muhammad of Islam, who says and does so very many things in the Hadith, and about whom we know so much because of the Hadith, that man did not exist, 100%. There is no record of such a person in the 7th century. Now, you may say you're just splitting hairs, because if you have a warrior prophet, it could have been this guy. Well, yeah, it could have been. Or it may have been that he's made up based on the bare fact of the understanding that there had been such a warrior prophet at this time, and all these legends got attached to him. Looking for John of Damascus. John of Damascus is aware of the Quran, and yet he seems to not have the Quran that we have now. Because he says that he's read all their frivolous tales, the Muslims, including the text of the woman, the text of the cow, the text of the table, and the text of the camel of God. Now, all of those, except the camel of God, are chapters of the Quran. But he doesn't say the Quran. He says he's read these texts. They may be 4 separate books: the woman, the table, the cow, and the camel of God. He doesn't give the impression that they're one book. But we can say, okay, maybe they're one book. But even if they're one book, the camel of God is referred to in the Quran several times, and it's kind of elliptical. It's not really very clear what is meant by it, but there is no text, there is no chapter of the camel of God. And so it seems as if the Quran to which John had access, if he had access to the Quran at all, and not to these separate books as separate writings, it was not the one we have. The standard narrative is that Uthman, as you mentioned, collected the Quran in the year 653 and standardized the text, burnt all the variants, and delivered it to the provinces, so that the Quran should have been standard after that, according to the standard story. So John, 75 years later, he's got the Quran. Why should he have a different one? And yet he does. And so the Quran seems, the standard story of the formation of the Quran seems also to not be historical and to have been retrojected back into history to the time of Uthman. But there isn't any evidence at the actual time of Uthman or up to the time of John of Damascus that such a book actually existed in its present form.
So another sort of objection that I was thinking about was, within the different Christian denominations, there's a lot of different views about Jesus, right? There's, and some of these differences are rather large. Like, suppose that you want to count Unitarians as Christians. Okay. In that case, you've got, like, every Christian, no matter what sect or no matter what denomination, is going to agree that there was a historical figure named Jesus, right? But they differ. There's lots of wide disagreement about what sort of characteristics or properties that this person had. So maybe could that be going on with Muhammad? So, for example, most Muslims today think that the Hadith literature is reliable and we can know a lot of information about Muhammad, but maybe they're just wrong. Maybe those properties don't actually sort of map on to Muhammad, just like the Unitarians are wrong, right? Those properties that they ascribe to Jesus don't actually map on to Jesus. Nevertheless, there was a historical person named Jesus. And so maybe even if the Hadith literature is unreliable, maybe there still was a historical person named Muhammad, because otherwise, what is the hypothesis here? What sort of hypothesis are we putting forward? Is your view that there were, there was a growing movement, and it's hard for me to even make sense of how the whole religion even got off the ground if there was no individual person that, supposedly received this revelation from Allah or whatever. So what is maybe that's a better way of asking my question. What is your competing hypothesis with the hypothesis that there was this sort of historical person, even if the Hadith literature is unreliable and those stories are not true? Nevertheless, there was some person named Muhammad that sort of got all this off the ground. What is your competing hypothesis? Was it just like some random group of people that got together and just made up this book completely out of whole cloth, or what exactly are you putting forward here?
All right, hold on. Now, you've said an awful lot.
I did. And so I apologize. And then I kind of shifted my point toward the end.
Yeah, if I could go back to the first part, there's quite a lot to say about that to start with. And then we can get to the alternative theory. The Unitarians, in the first place, this is not just an issue of differing interpretations. The different sects or denominations of Christianity, for the most part, unless you want to get into ones that are only marginally or arguably Christian at all, like the Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons, they don't have a different scripture. They don't have a different New Testament. They just see it all differently. And so that really is no analogy to what we're talking about here, because the question is not that maybe there's a different set of sources or a different group of canonical texts that we should refer to. We all agree on what the Hadith are and what the Sirah literature is constituted by, and what they say Muhammad said and did. The question is, where does all that come from? And Muslims to this day will tell you that they believe in Muhammad because they believe that the Hadith are reliable. They believe that it's actually a superior method of preserving material. They say that the New Testament, the Gospels, they don't tell you the isnads. They don't tell you who told you this stuff. And so, they discount it on that basis. Now, that's true. If their own construction of the sources for their material were not so clearly forged and fictional, that might have more weight. But that is the case, that even by their own admission, by the sources that they themselves are citing, we know that their material is unreliable, that a great deal of it was forged, including the isnad chains, the chains of transmission. So when we talk about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, and they say, we don't even know where these stories come from, and so on, that we fall back on the fact that they were circulating among the apostles at the time the apostles were alive, or many or most of them were alive, and that many of the followers of Jesus who had not been apostles were alive, like the 500 who saw him at one time that Paul refers to after the resurrection, and so on. And so the stories that were inaccurate would have been flagged and rejected. And so we have these four collections of material that have the approval of the community in living memory of the founder. That's sufficient. But it's very different from what we have in Islam. Now, as far as what else might have happened if you don't have Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, I'm sorry, just to repeat the last, just to emphasize or conclude the last bit, that's very different from theological disagreements among the followers of Jesus that arise centuries later and are all based on the same texts, but different understandings of the same texts. Anyway, in Islam, the idea is this, that it's very clear that Islam arose in a monotheistic setting, and the monotheism was already there. It was not, however, extraordinarily well defined. For example, Sophronius of Jerusalem, the bishop of Jerusalem at the time of the Arab conquest in the 630s, writes extensively about the conquerors and about the theological questions raised by the fact that God would allow his people to be overwhelmed and defeated and in many cases enslaved or killed by these people, by these invaders. And so it's noteworthy that Sophronius never calls them Muslims and never refers to Muhammad and never speaks about their having a new religion. But he does say that they destroyed churches and that they did so because they considered them idolatrous, and that they were calling people back to the strict monotheism that they were preaching. And so it seems like a curious omission that Sophronius makes no mention of Islam, and nobody else does either for that matter. And it seems most reasonable to conclude on that basis that there was no Islam at that time, but there was a creedally vague monotheism. And that creedally vague monotheism seems to have been related to an understanding of Christianity that may have come from Christian heretics, because we're talking about Arabia and we're talking about southern Iraq and those areas that were right outside the boundaries of the Roman Empire, the Christian Empire. In those days, if you were a heretic, you would be subjected to various forms of discrimination, and sometimes even worse. And so many of the heretics in the empire, the Christians whose faith was not orthodox, they left and went east to Iraq and Arabia. And there they taught their heresies without having to worry about the Roman authorities. And so they would teach Jesus is not divine. And then it's in the Quran. Jesus is not divine, and Jesus did not rise from the dead, and so on and so on. And so it seems as if that, along with this creedally vague monotheism that was already there among the Arabs, was then in the context of a dispute toward the end of the century between Abdul Malik and Abdullah ibn Zubair on the other side, who was a rival for the leadership of the Arabs, that they started to speak about the praised one, Muhammad, as a separate individual and as a prophet, and to construct a religion based around him, built on this strict monotheism that had already existed. And they did so because in those days, the great empires were held together by a religion. They didn't have constitutions and parliaments. And they weren't ethnically unified. The Romans were unified around Christianity. The Persians, the other great empire of the day, were unified around Zoroastrianism. The Arabs conquered all this territory and had this huge empire. And then Abdul Malik is dealing with the threat from Abdullah. And so he starts to try to unify the people around this strict monotheism centered on this person of Muhammad, who may have been a historical figure about whom little was known, or somebody that they started to tell stories about for whatever reason that people do that sort of thing. And myths grow like King Arthur and Robin Hood and so on. And this began to grow and became the way in the first place that after he beat Abdullah, how Abdul Malik unified his empire and held it together by making this religion and making it the foundation of the unity of the empire and making it martial and violent, because these were all warriors who were doing this. And that seems to be where it comes from.
So the Quran itself, what was the impetus for the initial writing of the Quran? I've interviewed Gabriel Reynolds about this, and he has a really interesting theory about how there were multiple editors of the Quran itself based on the doublets.
Yeah.
And he's got a very interesting theory, but what is your view on why the Quran was started to be being written in the first place?
Well, I believe that large portions of the Quran seem to have existed before Islam. There was an interesting thing. I wrote a book about these issues, if you will pardon the plug. Did Muhammad Exist? Wrote it first about 2010, and around 2015 or so, or later than that even, there was some big discovery.
The Birmingham? Are you talking about the Birmingham?
Yeah, that was carbon dated to 570 to 645 and
right.
of Quran manuscripts. And people were writing to me, Muslims, and saying, are you going to retract your book and apologize now? Because we have Muhammad's own Quran that he held in his hand, that this was being trumpeted as. But the carbon dating actually was from 570 to 645. Muhammad is supposed to become a prophet and start getting the Quran in 610. So 570 to 610, if that's possible, means that the alleged Quran manuscript actually predated Muhammad and Islam and is not a Quran at all. And Christoph Luxemburg, the great pseudonymous scholar of Syriac, has stripped away the diacritical marks that we already discussed were not original to the Quran anyway, and he repoints the Quran manuscripts in Aramaic and finds that a lot of the passages that are sort of chaotic and obscure in the Quran as it stands suddenly become clear when you read them as Aramaic. And this is extraordinary, that he posits that the word Quran, of course, which means lectionary, it's called that because it was a lectionary. But if you were to become a lector in your parish, then you're going to go up and you're going to read the epistle. And in the book, the lectionary, there'll be the epistle reading for the day. And then there'll be the epistle reading for the next day that might be from a completely different book of the New Testament. Mm-hmm. although usually they go in order for a while and then skip to another one. But anyway, if the Quran's a lectionary, that explains why it skips around with no subject matter classifications, no rhyme or reason to it. The Quran is not arranged chronologically. The Quran is not arranged thematically. There is no arrangement to the Quran that's discernible. But if it's a lectionary, then suddenly that makes sense, that you have a reading for some time and then the next reading for the next day or the next week and the next reading. And so they might not have any connection with one another. Anyway, this is something that comes from Luxemburg's researches. And the idea is that the Quran was cobbled together from various extant materials, which also would explain why it has passages from the Bible, not passages, stories from the Bible, no textual dependence, just stories heard, overheard, and repeated, half repeated, mangled, altered, various things. But you have passages from the Bible, you have material from Jewish sources, you have material from Zoroastrian sources, and it's all mashed up together to create the new holy book. Because when you're making a religion, you got to have a holy book. Religion's got holy books. The Christians have the Bible. The Jews have the Bible too, but it's a little bit different. The Persians have the, the Zendavesta. And so you make a scripture, but you make it out of material that already exists. And you alter it if needed.
So that material, where did it originally come from? Maybe I missed it. Maybe you already went over this.
Yeah,
and I apologize if so.
Material, it's Jewish material, it's Zoroastrian material, and some of it is a Christian lectionary, and some of it is material from other sources.
From these heretical Christians?
Yes, some of it is from the heretical Christians, which is why you have these ideas of Jesus. The very first thing I wrote about Islam in 1983, I guess it was. Wow. I wrote a paper on they did not kill nor crucify him, but it appeared so to them. It's chapter 4, verse 157 of the Quran about Jesus, that they did not kill or crucify him, but the Jews thought they had crucified him. And I traced that to, there's not a mention of this. It was just speculation, but it is noteworthy that several Gnostic Gospels and Gnostic documents. You know Gnostic Christianity? It was a Christian community, and they believed that matter is evil and that Jesus is the Savior who comes and he's not really real. You can pass your hand right through him. This is why John, in the Epistle of John, says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have touched with our hands. He has to emphasize that because the Gnostics were saying he was just a ghost. You could pass your hand right through him. You wouldn't touch him because he did not have physical being, because matter is evil. All right? So the Gnostics were teaching this stuff, and the second treatise of the Great Seth is a Gnostic document that has Jesus laughing while Judas is being crucified. Not Judas Iscariot, but Judas Thomas the twin. Thomas called the twin, one of the 12, the doubter. And he's being crucified in this gospel while Jesus is up above, the pure spirit with no body. And he's laughing at them because they're so stupid, and they took his twin for himself. So anyway, this is Gnostic Christianity, and this seems to be what was picked up in early Islam, that Jesus he just seemed to be in a body and was not actually crucified. This is something they took over from the Gnostics. And so you have this kind of thing being taken from various sources and all put together, jumbled up, with no apparent attempt to organize it in any way, but just bits taken from here and there. I mean, if you believe that Muhammad actually originated the Quran, then you've got to believe he was an extraordinarily strange person, which of course is perfectly reasonable, because Islam is extraordinarily strange. But you read the Quran straight and you read it attentively, you find that it skips from one subject to another with no rhyme or reason, with no explanation, with no possible connection between the two sections within chapters. It's not like chapter 3 is all about X and chapter 4 is all about Y. It's that this part of chapter 3 is all about X, and then the next part is all about Y, and the next part is all about Q, and it just flies from one thing to another with no connection whatsoever, which would make sense if you've got a group of people or various groups of people sticking in parts that they wanted.
Does that make sense also? I mean, this is one thing that's really appealing to me with respect to the Islamic dilemma. Is that why you think something like the Islamic dilemma is even a thing? Is because
precisely because one group of people thinks that their book confirms the Torah and the gospel. So they stick that in. And they don't have any idea because they haven't had acquaintance with the actual Torah and gospel, because written books are not so easy to come by when you have to copy each one out by hand. And so that's one thing. And then you have another group that may have encountered or knows Christians or something and knows that these things don't correspond. And so they have to start saying, you corrupted your scriptures, which, of course, as you know, is not actually in the Quran, but it's very strong in Islamic tradition because it's the only thing that explains away these passages.
This does have some really strong, I think, explanatory power. It can explain all of the weird passages that we find in the Quran, like Surah 930 about Ezra and Jews worshiping Ezra. It's like, where did that come from? Like, what?
Well, nobody actually knows. It's possible that there was some group of Jews that were revering Ezra in some way that have completely died out. That seems least likely, though. What is more likely is that this is a misunderstood passage from something or other, just like they misunderstand the Trinity and think that it's Allah, Jesus, and Mary, that this is some misunderstood reference to Ezra having some status or other that they don't understand, or a mistranslation or misinterpretation based on faulty pointing, based on the wrong diacritical marks being put down, you see, or some combination of those things.
Ooh, this is just really, if I was a Muslim, I would be very troubled. I mean, even just in this what we've covered so far, this is just really troubling stuff. Maybe we can kind of shift gears and we can bring it back to the topic of whether or not Muhammad existed. And there's two arguments I want to put forward. I won't give them both at one time to overwhelm you like I did that other question. So the first one is, and this one just occurred to me, so it may not be that great, but if there is, suppose that the Hadith literature is unreliable. Okay, suppose that, and that's basically what you've argued. You've argued obviously more than that, but the Hadith literature, let's take it for granted that it's unreliable. Isn't it still some kind of evidence that there was a person named Muhammad that did some stuff back then, even if all of the literature, the Hadith literature is unreliable? Like, they were still trying to get back to this original person because that person actually existed. There's some evidence from the Hadith literature.
They're not trying to get back, obviously, or they'd be, well, they are trying, yeah, because they are trying by means of the isnad chains to get back to the original stories. Yes, that is true. At the same time, with the legendary elaboration, they're moving even farther away from the possibility of doing that. But yeah, like I said before, there may have been some guy, but the question is whether he's like King Arthur or, well, actually, I think
Santa Claus.
Santa Claus. That's a good one. That King Arthur seems to have actually existed. But the Round Table, the knights, Guinevere and Lancelot and all that stuff, there's no basis to believe any of that actually happened. Maybe some of it did. But it's much more likely that whatever King Arthur was in real life, he became, for whatever reason, because he's foundational to the English story or whatever, he became the hanger on which all these stories get hung, and they get passed down to us in that form, but that doesn't mean they have any historical value. Or Muhammad could be like Santa Claus. Well, actually, there was a St. Nicholas, And so
there was a Saint Nicholas. Yeah, I was going to say.
He was known for his generosity, and that's why these stories get attached to him. So there you go. Maybe maybe there really was. But I mean, of course, there are plenty of fictional characters that we can name.
The other objection, the other sort of pushback I can offer, which it's along the lines of what you encountered in your debate with David, where there's all of these embarrassing stories about Muhammad in the Hadith, but then also in the Quran itself. Like there seems to be the adopted son story. There's just a lot of weird, embarrassing stuff. I thought, okay, so my card's on the table. I don't really buy that argument. I think that you had a really good response to David in your debate. So I'm not on David's side with this one, but maybe we can kind of flesh it out a little bit more here. Why don't you think those embarrassing stories tell us that there was a real historical person that was named Muhammad that actually did these things? Because the criteria of embarrassment, with respect to the Gospels, if you guys have never heard of this sort of historical criteria, the women are the first ones to have stumbled upon the empty tomb. But in those times, a woman's testimony was not as trusted as a man's. And so that's sort of a quote unquote embarrassing detail that actually lends historical credibility to those accounts being accurate, that it was actually women that saw it first. So then switching back to Muhammad, there was all these embarrassing stories about Muhammad in the Quran, and I'm sure that you can spell some of those out for us. But yeah, why don't those also lend credibility to the existence of such a person?
Yeah. Sorry. I just got to get you back here. I jostled my screen and you vanished. There you are. The criterion of embarrassment is one that is sort of culturally tone deaf, with all respect, because it assumes that what embarrasses us would embarrass the people in the 9th century. And that's not necessarily the case. So, for example, David, of course, is a brilliant man, and
the guy is brilliant. I mean, he's also just like fun to listen to. And I loved the fact that in y'all's debate, you were like laughing at the way that he was presenting and stuff, because you just appreciated his genius. Yeah.
I wish I could be a tenth as funny as David is. And he had the whole crowd laughing and me laughing when he's talking about the stories of Aisha scraping the semen off Muhammad's clothes. And you got to think, why on earth would anybody want to fabricate? And of course, we should remember that I'm not saying these stories were necessarily fabricated, that they may have been amalgamated from a number of earlier sources, such that there really was somebody, whoever he may have been, who these stories were passed on about, and his child bride scraped semen off his clothes. But why would anybody pass that on? And so David's argument is it had to have happened. And they passed it on because they felt duty bound to do so, because otherwise they would not be preserving an authentic story about their prophet. The ain't necessarily so aspect of that is that there's nothing necessarily embarrassing about it. If you are a 7th century person, a male who values being a male and thinks that, and doesn't have 21st century mores or even, and much less Christian morality. And so you think this guy is constantly being covered with semen. He's a real man. He's just positively flowing in it. It's always gushing out of him because he's so manly. Wow, I want to be like that. Why not? What can you say? Can you say, well, no, that wouldn't have happened. That couldn't have happened. No, you can't. And I can't say that it did either, except that we know that Christian morality didn't prevail in those areas at that time, that this is indeed a religion that is deeply centered upon sex and has a very different idea of morality from Christian morality, such that even paradise is just having sex all the time. And when you consider that then is the highest good that they're offering to human beings, then it becomes a very different kind of story. And so what I'm saying in general, and what people who hold to this view are saying in general, is that the embarrassing stories are not necessarily embarrassing to people of the time.
Even down to marrying Aisha at 6 years old.
Yeah, sure.
As well.
Especially if you want to marry a 6-year-old, then it's very convenient for you that you have a prophet who did this, who's the excellent example that you should emulate. And so if anybody possibly objects and says you shouldn't marry a 6-year-old, then you say, well, Muhammad did it. How could it be wrong? He's the excellent example. And so that's precisely the kind of story that you would want to have in there if you were so inclined.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, I think that pushback does make a lot of sense. You got to jump into the mind of a 6th century, 7th century, 8th century, maybe 9th century Arab, right?
Yeah.
And you've got to get into their mindset as opposed to looking at it through our lens, through our cultural lens, and looking back at it and be like, that's embarrassing stuff, which, it is to us, but back then, maybe not.
And you mentioned the daughter-in-law. And that is a story that's kind of unique in Islamic literature. For those who don't know, I'll just tell the story very briefly. Muhammad had an adopted son, Zayd, and he had a wife, Zainab, who was very beautiful. Muhammad one day goes to see Zayd, and he ain't home. And Zainab, because she is used to thinking that this is like her father, it's her father-in-law, and they're all one big happy family, she answers the door in a state of semi-undress. Muhammad is overcome with her beauty, goes away saying glory to God for creating all this great beauty and so on. He's very flustered, he's very upset. And Zayd, who doesn't get along so well with Zainab, he goes and says, how about I divorce her and you marry her? And Muhammad says, no, keep your wife and fear Allah. And later then Muhammad gets a revelation where Allah says, why do you want to not take what I want to give you? And when you said keep your wife and fear Allah, you were going against what I wanted to give you. And so he wakes up from his trance and he tells people, who will go tell Zainab that Allah has married her to me? And people were upset and said, how could he have married his daughter-in-law? And so in order to alleviate the scandal, Allah forbids adoption. And so Zayd is no longer his adopted son. Zainab is no longer his daughter-in-law. Everything's okay. And so people throughout history, Christians and others have said, you see, you're revering this immoral man, this lecherous, lustful man as a prophet. And so that's been embarrassing in the story itself. People were talking about it, and that's why Allah forbade adoption. And later on in history, people talk about it and embarrass Muslims about it to this day. However, even this story could very easily have been invented for other purposes or appropriated for other purposes. The Quran tells the story in chapter 33, and it tells it very elliptically. It does not just tell the story in a straightforward manner. It acts as if you already know the story. It forbids adoption a couple times, and then it says, and when you, I'll actually read it. I have it open here. It says, and when you said to him on whom Allah has conferred favor, and you have conferred favor, keep your wife to yourself and fear Allah. And you hid in your mind what Allah was going to bring to light, and you feared mankind, whereas Allah has a better right that you should fear him. So when Zayd had performed that necessary formality from her, we gave her to you in marriage, so that there may be no sin for believers in regard to the wives of their adopted sons. So this is all about forbidding adoption, supposedly. But then it goes on, and in verse 40 it says, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, but he is the messenger of Allah and the seal of the prophets. Now, that doesn't go with the story at all. The story has nothing to do with Muhammad being the messenger of Allah or the seal of the prophets. So, was it just stuck there randomly, that verse? As I said before, all sorts of things are stuck everywhere in the Quran randomly? Maybe. Or it could be actually part of the story and the whole point of the story. And the point of the story would then be that Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, whether natural or adopted, because he had no natural sons that survived to adulthood. And that as he is not the father of any of your men, he's the seal of the prophets. Because in the Quran, all the prophets are related. And the prophetic spirit is thus passed on genetically. So if Muhammad had a son, he would have been a prophet. If you want to say Muhammad is the last prophet, he can't have any sons. So this whole story is all about how he doesn't have any sons. Therefore, he's the last prophet. It's designed to prevent other prophets from arising in the Islamic community and splitting it.
But then why have him marry his adopted son's wife?
So that you know that there's not even adoption, that he can't even have an adopted son. There is no son of any kind for Muhammad. So he's the last prophet, therefore.
Couldn't he though have gotten rid of adoption and then not married her?
Yeah, sure. But the whole point is that he got rid of adoption to marry her. He has to have some reason to get rid of adoption. Otherwise, it's just out of the blue.
Okay, I see. Otherwise, he's just getting rid of adoption for the sake of it. I guess he still could have done that.
Well, sure. We could speculate on all kinds of things he could have done. But my point is only that there is the possibility that this whole story was created in order to emphasize that Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, which is something that all of Islamic tradition is deeply concerned about, because then they know, see, anybody who declares himself a prophet could then become a new power center, and there could be a revolution, there could be a splitting of the kingdom, there could be of the caliphate, that is, there could be a civil war. But if you know ipso facto right away, you know without any shadow of a doubt that anybody who says he's a prophet after Muhammad is not, then you can nip those movements in the bud and preserve the unity of the community, which they've succeeded in doing, actually, largely throughout history.
So maybe one more question, and then we'll start to wrap things up here. So what about the account, and I'm terrible with references, so you'll have to help me with this one. The account of him getting more wives in the Quran, where does that occur? Because that also seems kind of embarrassing along the same lines.
Yeah, there is a passage, I'm blanking on where it is myself right now, but it does say that the prophet gets more wives than the ordinary believers. And what I am positing is that this material was amalgamated together from material involving a lot of different people. And so there may have been somebody who was claiming to be a prophet who got the permission to have more wives than other people. It may have been that some ruler thought, I need to get more wives than other people, and I'm not a prophet, but I can extrapolate from Muhammad getting permission to have more wives than ordinary people, or something of that kind. But in any case, the fact that we have the Quran saying that, and Islamic tradition saying that Muhammad did indeed have more wives than were allowed for the average Muslim man, does not necessarily mean that Muhammad is historical. It could be that the story of Muhammad is constructed so that he has more wives than the average Muslim man, because that is a text in the Quran. And so, I mean, there are plenty of stories in the Quran where there are two different explanations in the Hadith, which militates against the idea that either one of them is the real explanation. What I mean is, there is Asbab an-Nuzul literature all through the Hadith. The Asbab an-Nuzul is the circumstances of revelation. So you have a Quran passage, there's a whole literature of the circumstances in Muhammad's life that gave rise to this Quran passage. And that's the Asbab an-Nuzul. So in many cases, you have more than one. And both are likely to not be true, but they can't both be true. one might be true and the other not, or they're both not true, but they're not likely to be both true. And I can give you an example in a minute. But that's what I'm saying about this, that it's possible that a great deal of the life of Muhammad as it now stands was created or altered in order to fit what ended up in the Quran. So you have the Quran saying he's got more wives. You got to get a story where he's got more wives, or several stories, so that it fits. What I'm referring to about there being different stories, take, for example, chapter 66. And I'll get it here real quick. Chapter 66 at the beginning says this: "O Prophet, why do you prohibit what Allah has made lawful to you?" See, there again, just like in 33, he's always saying, "Oh, I don't want to have what Allah wants me to have." "Trying to please your wives. And Allah is forgiving, merciful. Allah has made lawful for you absolution from your oaths. And Allah is your protector. He is the knower, the wise one. When the Prophet confided a fact to one of his wives, and when she afterward revealed it, and Allah told him about this, he made part of it known and passed over a part. And when he told it to her, she said, 'Who has told you?' He said, 'The knower, the aware, has told me.' If you two turn in repentance to Allah for what your hearts desired, and if you help one another against him, then indeed Allah, even He, is His protecting friend, and Gabriel and the righteous among the believers, and furthermore the angels are His helpers. It may happen that His Lord, if He divorces you, will give Him in your place wives who are better than you, Muslim, believing, pious, penitent, devout, inclined to fasting, widows and maidens." All right, so that's the passage from the Quran, chapter 66. And the standard explanation is that Muhammad was going out, and this is based on a hadith. Muhammad was going around to his wives in an order. Everyone has a night, you know? Like, oh, it's Tuesday, that's Aisha. It's Wednesday, that's Hafsa. It's Thursday, that's Zainab, whoever. So he skips a night, he skips a girl and goes to sleep with Mary the Copt, his slave girl. And the wives get mad at him. So Allah comes to save the day and tells them, "Hey, you better back off or he'll divorce you and I'll give him better wives." Okay? But there's a whole other story in other hadith where Muhammad is sneaking honey. It has nothing to do with going around behind the back of his wives. He's sneaking honey and it gives him bad breath. And he told them he wouldn't eat honey. So he goes and sneaks honey, and they get mad, and Allah threatens them that he'll divorce them. Now, it seems to me when you have two wildly divergent stories like that, most likely they're both made up to explain these elliptical references in the Quran. The Quran's referring to something. We don't have any idea what, and neither do the people who write the hadith. And they come up with two wildly different stories to explain it.